Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to our special webinar, Where Do We Go From Here? Finding Anti-Racist Common Ground After 2020. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Watson Institute and Brown University Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. It's also part of a broader series of seminars that the university has been organizing surrounding the 2020 US presidential election. For me personally, I'd be understating this situation if I said I found the past 4 years troubling and unsettling and depressing and at times even terrifying with respect to issues of race and racism in the United States. You know, President Obama in his new memoir refers to an incident that took place back in the summer of 2009, the arrest of Henry Louis Gates on the porch of Professor Gates' own home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when he was trying to get back in after returning from a trip. And at the time, when Obama said that the white police officer who had arrested Professor Gates had acted stupidly, there was quite an uproar, especially among white Americans. Reflecting on that moment now, President Obama wrote, with respect generally to the issue of Black people and policing, that this experience was a reminder, quote, that the basis of our nation's social order had never been simply about consent, that it was also about centuries of state-sponsored violence by whites against Black and brown people, unquote. Well, the last 4 years have certainly reinforced that point. From Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony to the present, we've been exposed to highly racialized rhetoric from the president, none too subtle support for white supremacy, and aggressive and open voter suppression efforts, just to name a few. We've witnessed grotesque instances of police violence against Black and brown citizens, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, others, and then political and racial divides in the response, with Black Lives Matter sometimes countered with All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. We've witnessed vast, really unspeakable racial disparities in the incidence and lethality of COVID, all in the context of a president who's dismissed the importance of the pandemic, undermined efforts to deal with it, and now seems to be promoting ideas of herd immunity, which, if permitted to unfold, would surely impact Black and brown communities disproportionately. But after 4 years of this, we witnessed in the last election 73 million Americans, that's 47% of the electorate, vote for the president. We've seen growing support for President Trump among portions of the Latinx voters and also portions of the Black community. Moreover, we've witnessed a very substantial showing by the president's own party in the elections. And we've already begun to witness divisions in the Democratic Party between a discourse on the one hand of healing and unity versus a discourse on the other of pushing for justice and, quote, the restitution in addition to absolution, unquote, which is a phrase Boston Globe columnist Renee Graham used in today's paper. And of course, there are lots of debates about even just the phrase defunding the police. So where do we go from here? We have an absolutely phenomenal panel today to discuss these issues. I feel so honored just to be present, a member of the audience, to listen to them. I'll just name them in the order in which they'll be speaking. Please forgive me for not providing big introductions for which these individuals really are worthy, but we'll provide links to their bios on the screen. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes and then we'll open it up to questions. For those of you participating in this event through Zoom, you can ask questions in the Q&A window and we'll monitor those. And for those of you watching on YouTube Live, you can ask questions directly on YouTube and the questions will be relayed to me. Our panelists today, all my esteemed colleagues, are Melvin Rogers, Associate Professor of Political Science, Margaret Weir, Wilson Professor of International and Public Affairs and Political Science, Ainsley Lesueur, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies, Bonnie Honig, the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Modern Culture and Media and Political Science, Laura López-Sanders, Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Tricia Rose, the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies, Associate Dean of the Faculty for Special Initiatives, and Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. Melvin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, first, let me first thank Tricia Rose for the invitation, and I would like to thank Ed Steinfeld for moderating and for that very nice introduction. I am delighted to join my colleagues and and reflect on really what I take to be a very terrible place we find ourselves in politically and culturally in this country. And I must say that I am, to be quite candid with you, I'm not yet in a place where I'm able to offer an answer to the question of where do we go from here? Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book, from which this panel draws its title, I mean, we must wonder yet again if our futures will be defined by chaos or community. And those two words, chaos or community, are words that served as the subtitle of that 1967 book by King. So let me tell you a story, a brief story, and let me show you or explain or lay out why I am not yet in a place to offer guidance. I mean, so much of what I say here will emerge from a way of perceiving or of understanding the political and cultural landscape we now occupy. And much of my work in political theory, even when it is historically informed, is about improving our perceptual capacities as democratic citizens, improving our capacities to see and hear and feel the grievances of others, in particular, those who are African-American, Black people in this country. What I want to suggest to you in these few moments is that our political and cultural landscape is currently structured by a sense of betrayal. And if that is my beginning point, it is my beginning point, I'm not sure how the reparative work can begin. So like a great many people, the television in my home was set to CNN beginning election night, and it remained on that station for the next 4 days or so. My partner and I were in the living room on Saturday, November 7th, when Wolf Blitzer announced that Joseph Biden would be the next president, denying, as Blitzer said, President Trump a second term. And my partner and I both jumped in excitement. We knew it was coming, but it was a different thing to get the confirmation. And at that moment, we, like many others, I suspect, were relieved. But that excitement, my excitement, quickly dissipated because on that screen, I could also see the total votes for each candidate. And Trump was in the 70 million range, trailing Biden, I suppose, by a couple of million. Now, these votes represented people, actual people. They are strangers to me, I'm sure of that, but they are nonetheless, I thought, fellow Americans. And regardless of what I may like to tell myself, regardless of what you may like to tell yourself, we share a life with these 70 million people. We are not the same, we are not identical from beginning to end, but our lives are bound together by common practices, by common basic institutional structures, common terms in which we articulate our sort of dreams and our aspirations, a common political culture, and running through it all are shared memories of this society to which we belong. These things give thickness to our civic connections, and they point to our shared attachments, even as we are, personally speaking, strangers to one another. This sense that I share a life with 70 million people is the reason why my excitement dissipated. Right? These 70 million plus that voted for Trump, this is the reason why the excitement went away. I felt, in a word, betrayed, and perhaps many of you did as well. And where the sense of betrayal is active, another idea is close at hand: distrust. Distrust of those with whom you share society. A sense, to just be quite honest, that you are not safe with them. Or to put the matter differently, so as not to make this too personal and to draw out the power of the point, these 70 million people have seen Trump elevate cronies over experts. They have watched him admire the governing styles of dictators. They have watched as Trump insisted through his words and his policies that immigrants were not owed basic human decency. They have watched him ignore the facts regarding COVID-19 because to acknowledge them, he believed, would harm his election chances. They have watched him effortlessly offer kind words for self-identified white nationalists. And they have watched him conjure feelings of racial resentment among those loyal to him. And in the face of all of this, 70 million people thirsted for more. They thirsted for more because I wager they believed in Trump. Now you might say to me, and this is my last point, you might say to me, oh, this has all become far too heavy. This language of thickness, of betrayal, is not the language of politics. The language of betrayal, you might think, conjures the image of the traitor, and when treason defines the political landscape, we would do well not to look for civic friends, you might think. President-elect Biden knows this all too well. This is why he continues to go on invoking then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama's 2004 Democratic National Convention keynote, invoking the idea that we are not red states and blue states, we're the United States of America. And this is why President-elect Biden tells us every chance he gets, we may be opponents, but we are not enemies. He knows that beginning with the language of betrayal frustrates political action before it can begin. And yet, 70 million Americans engaged in what feels like, what looks like betrayal. And while I'm not sure how we begin the reparative work, I'm certain that it will not begin without confronting this fact. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers, Tricia Rose and Ed Steinfeld. I want to talk today about Donald Trump first to see where we've been and then suggest where we might go. Donald Trump did not invent white grievance, but from his embrace of birtherism on, Trump's politics were predicated on the illegitimacy of a Black president, and they were dedicated to stoking the sense of white racial oppression in an increasingly diverse country. 4 years of concerted efforts to set groups against one another has not only enhanced the public presence of extremist organization, it has also worked to embed and normalize racism in mainstream institutions. So I'm going to talk about race and racism in 3 institutions that have formed the backbone of political support for Trump, to see part of where we've been and suggest what they and say what they suggest about where we go. So let me start with the police. George Floyd's murder was not the action of a rogue police officer, but evidence of a much more systemic problem in police forces across the country. A recent study of Facebook pages frequented by police officers revealed many thousands of racist and Islamophobic posts. Trump's embrace of the police, whose union supported him for president in 2016 and 2020, introduced a new and destructive perspective on policing, namely that any criticism of the police is by definition illegitimate. In contrast with Obama's Justice Department, which entered into 15 consent decrees in order to reform and monitor police departments, the Trump administration refused to use consent decrees and actively undermined the few remaining agreements still in effect. The second institution I want to mention is the Republican Party. Donald Trump was not the candidate of the Republican establishment, but from Nixon on, the party has relied on a racist imagery and allusions as a standard part of its campaigning and governing, from Law and Order, which Nixon borrowed from George Wallace, to Reagan's welfare queen. The dog whistle has been a fixture in Republican politics. But in 2012, after Mitt Romney's loss, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, issued a study that called on the party to reach out to Black and Latino voters, warning that the appeal to whites alone would relegate the party to minority status. Under Trump, the report was removed from the RNC website, and we just experienced an election where the central Republican strategy was vote suppression targeted at minorities. Trump lost, but I think that the election results do not bode well for a Republican Party reckoning on race. The fact that Trump generated tremendous white turnout and won a greater number of Latino voters and even a few more Black votes in 2016 will invite imitation of his strategy rather than repudiation of it. Finally, I want to say a word about evangelicals. With their extremely high turnout rates, evangelicals have formed the base of Republican Party for 40 years. Trump assiduously courted this group, whose central concern is their fear about the waning dominance of a white Christian country that honors Southern traditions. Polls show that overwhelming majorities of white evangelicals see Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag as a symbol of Southern pride that should be honored. Trump catered to these voters not only through his court appointments, but also by welcoming the Confederate flag at his rallies and refusing to rename military bases that honor Confederate slaveholders. So where does this leave us? Stirring up racial and ethnic hatred is the oldest of political strategies in American politics. When normalized into mainstream institutions, it deepens divisions and creates huge obstacles for forging common ground. Yet I would highlight several paths forward. The first is for the Biden Justice Department to aggressively use its power to challenge systemic violations of civil rights by police departments. Make it unmistakable where the federal government stands, and make it clear that the federal government will use its authority to challenge racist police practices. Second, the Republican Party. One of the most distressing things about the last 4 years is watching the Republican Party become the party of Trump. After the 2020 election, I'm not optimistic about changes in that party. But what I am optimistic about are the examples of Georgia and Arizona, where years of work by grassroots organizations demonstrated the possibilities for building multiracial, inclusive politics. And then finally, on religion. Religion can and must play a proactive role in combating racism and racial divisions. Racial congregations have done this in the past, not only Black churches, but white congregations as well. Engaging white congregations in anti-racist work is easy to say, but hard to do. A community organizer told me about a white church in Minneapolis, located in the middle of the Black Lives Matter protests. The church faced a decision about whether they should open their doors to protesters who wanted to come in and rest. After 20 minutes of calls around to church leaders, they decided to welcome protesters in. And when asked why they were able to act so quickly, the minister explained that behind those 20 minutes of calls were 20 years of anti-racist work that church leaders and congregation members had engaged in. As that story suggests, finding common ground on issues of race is not something that is easily achieved in a country with our history. 4 years of Trump has set us back. But we also know that using public powers to enforce civil rights from above and organizing from below can put us back on the road toward building a successful and inclusive multiracial country. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ansley. And I want to start by saying that Republican elites like Mitch McConnell's support of Trump's baseless claims of voter fraud have been quite alarming to witness. Not because I'm surprised. The hard bed that we are currently lying in has been in the making for quite some time, but because it's not clear to me how much longer people committed to authoritarian white racial rule can hold the reins of democratic power, use that power to delegitimize the most fundamental determinant of that power, voting, before it all comes tumbling down. This is not to say that there is no hope of averting full-on catastrophe, but the path to diverting it seems to be getting narrower and narrower. It's much like the early months we spent reckoning with how the Rona had fundamentally shifted the possibility of life as we had previously known it. With every public lie uttered by the Trump administration, with every refusal to coordinate a national response, the closer we got to the road of no return, we are currently living what was the worst case scenario then. Was this experience with the Rona a dress rehearsal for the political upheaval that is headed our way? What is so interesting about this moment is the way that these baseless claims about voter fraud mirror the impending demographic shifts that demographers have projected for some time now. By 2045 or sooner, white people will no longer constitute the racial majority of the United States. For the first time in the nation's history, they will be a minority. This impending demographic shift is significant for reflecting about how we've gotten here. There is a longer historical story one could tell, but I'll go back just 4 years. I think I was one of the few people in this country, and this includes Trump, who was not surprised when Trump won the 2016 election against Hillary Clinton. Fueling my sense was the wisdom that Joy Ann Reid had spoken in the South Side of Chicago in Hyde Park Seminary Co-op bookstore, promoting her new book, Fracture, at the time. Wisdom that had guided many electoral campaigns across the country for some time. The wisdom that was when voter turnout is high, Democrats win elections. When it is typical, Republicans have a greater chance of winning. This is especially true when it comes to presidential elections. This law was on display when Obama won his second term as president in 2012. The coalition that won Obama the presidency in 2008 had undergone a significant shift by 2012. Though he had secured the presidency in 2008 in part by throwing Jeremiah Wright, an old school civil rights Black leadership, under the bus in his infamous A More Perfect Union speech, the sheer number of Black voters activated because it seemed to them that white folks wanted the Black president to fail, delivered Obama his win in 2012. When voter turnout is high, particularly when Black voters are energized to go to the polls and stand in long lines, it turns out that Democrats can withstand the defection of the kind of white voter who had cast a vote for Obama in 2008, but turned its back on him in 2012. Clinton's 2016 campaign did not energize voters in the same way. There is much we could say about why this was the case, but for now, it is simply important to note that voter turnout was low or typical even. And much to many people's surprise, the Republicans were delivered the reins of the executive office in 2016. During his presidency, Trump has wreaked tremendous havoc on the American political system, and Republican elites and their constituency has authorized his tremendous abuse at every single turn. The separation of families at the border, the criminalization of Black Lives Matter and undocumented immigrants, lies about Antifa to counter documented intelligence that white supremacist groups are the country's greatest domestic threat, and the list can go on and on. Trump's cavalier reign of terror over the last 4 years, together with the heroic grassroots efforts that unleashed a valiant fight against the anti-democratic enterprise of voter suppression in densely packed contested urban centers, where the most crucial segments of the Democratic Party's majority resides, resulted in unprecedented voter turnout that won Democrats the presidency in 2020. Yet the opening that the people have secured with their voting majority may be squandered by those who seem to think that the way forward is to persuade enough of a reasonable minority of the GOP to work collaboratively toward a greater, more stable American good. Far too many Democrats are committed to pursuing this collaborative conciliatory approach time and time again to no avail. Republicans and their constituencies double down. One could conclude that the Dems' commitment to doing the same conciliatory move over and over again while expecting different results is the essential definition of political insanity. If we are not going to squander the opening that the people have made, Democrats need to acknowledge the significance of the Republican political strategy, appeals to its white base, voter suppression, gerrymandering, and the pursuit of presidential power through the mysteries of electoral college math. That Republicans are promising its people to maintain white power through minority rule. We are facing circumstances that will not even allow white rule to appear democratic at all. And the anti-democratic measures that were put in place to challenge tyrannical majorities, a way to characterize the regime of racial power that has determined much of American politics up to this point, is prepared to take the form of a forceful, violating political minority. And if we are not going to squander this opening, we're going to have to break the political and social habits that have trained far too many of us to empathize with the desire for the power to dominate and empathize with the suffering of those who must imagine a life worth living without this access to domination. That's what I think the way forward is, but I'm not completely sure that it's possible under these circumstances. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Honig. Thank you for this panel. For many of us, the last 4 years are bookended by the 2017 Unite the Right rally, which gathered hundreds of alt-right activists at Charlottesville, Virginia, and this past weekend's Million MAGA march of a few thousand Trump supporters in DC. Both gatherings wanted to appear in public, to be on TV and not just on Facebook or Parler, which means that they're not content to stay hidden. They want to move from the two-worldism of conspiracy into our real world. Tricia Rose asked our panel about this. What do we do, she said, now that Pandora's box has been opened and the racist views of such conspiracists have been normalized? That got me thinking about Pandora. In the ancient Greek myth, Pandora was the first woman and the world was perfect, like Eden. After Pandora married, Zeus gave her a box for safekeeping and told her never to open it, and she promised not to. But she got curious, and one day she lifted the lid. Out of the box flew all of the evils of the world: hate, cruelty, violence, prejudice. And then last of all, hope flew out too. The conventional reading of the myth is misogynist. It pins all of the world's evils on one woman. But what if the story is not about how one world was ruined by the contents of a box, but of two worlds, one in the box and one outside of it, each with its own values and its own facts, and they don't intersect? In this case, the myth is not a fall narrative about perfection ruined, but of two-worldism unmasked. On this reading, it's because of Pandora's curiosity, her desire to know the truth, that we're moved from two parallel worlds, one innocent of evil and the other its repository, into one world where they coexist. Two-worldism has long been a feature of American politics. It is why the white heirs of Thomas Jefferson destroyed his letters to Sally Hemings, to preserve their white world without having to acknowledge the other one where he also lived. It was the forensic work of Annette Gordon-Reed that first forced Jefferson's two parallel worlds into intersection by telling the story of Sally Hemings and her family. I think of Gordon-Reed as a Pandora figure. She was curious about what was in the box. She went to look in the archives, and she found not the letters, which had been destroyed, but evidence that led her to find what Pandora found: one world, in which Jefferson had two families, one white, one black, two households, two genealogies. But these are in fact one. The Jefferson of the Declaration is the Jefferson of slavery, one world. I think we need to do something similar now on a larger scale, to produce a forensic accounting of the last 4 years following, as Gordon-Reed did, the money and the travel records to bring Trump's parallel world of emoluments and grift to light. I think we need a Truth and Reckoning Commission. Reconciliation is too much to hope for. The Biden administration may try to avoid such a reckoning, but that would be a mistake. We need a public accounting of what was done in this presidency and by whom. It needs to be truly public, not the work of a party, but the work of the country. Think of it as a truth New Deal. In addition to following the money stolen from the public, the whole country can be mobilized to hear in courtrooms and churches, public parks, drive-ins, schools, and on TV, the testimony of witnesses to structural violence, the testimony of kids separated from families at the southern border, the detained women sterilized by a doctor in Georgia, the survivors of those who died at the hands of police violence, and from those who lost loved ones to COVID. It might be a sentimental education. It might work. It's important that it be a varied and plural effort, hosted in different parts of the country like a kind of traveling circus, with rallies, but different from the ones we've watched for the last 4 years. Bringing people together to listen and tell their stories too. After the epidemic ends, we would create a public around a public thing, a ritual that would provide a bridge for those who want to cross. Wrongdoers would have to be named so that the complicit could be shunned, not offered cushy think tank jobs, lectureships, or TV shows, nor able to run for president in 2024 as if in a parallel world where their crimes were never committed. We could hold hearings about disinformation, which technologies enable it, who spreads it, and who profits. Films, comic books, and TED Talks can educate the public. Broadway and Hollywood stars can narrate to draw people in. It's a national project, like the first New Deal. It should be photographed and the images shown online and in museums and in the streets. It'll create employment for those in need of work and return us to supporting the arts. We can make quilts of memory and futurity. One product could be a curriculum for middle and high school teachers about how we got here and what skills of citizenship and collective values are needed to get us out and stay out. American politics has always been shadowed by conspiracies that operate out of the mainstream, but their real challenge to democracy lies not only in their specific, usually racist, sexist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic programs, but in their successful creation of parallel worlds. The challenge is how to bring parallel worlds into intersection. We have to open the box. A Truth and Reckoning Commission does that. I don't fully expect a Biden-Harris administration to pursue it, but I think it's what we have to push for. I want to close with two other examples that also try to create intersection where others seek parallel worlds. The Lincoln Project put up a giant billboard in New York City's Times Square showing images of Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump saying awful things that implicate them in the COVID disaster. Jared and Ivanka threatened to sue, which means they know what's at stake. The billboards refuse the shelter of parallel worlds to those who will soon be seeking their refuge. It's fitting then that the billboards are placed at one of the city's most famous intersections. Parallel worlds cannot survive intersection. The second example comes from the movie Gaslight, in which a man seeks to drive his wife insane so he can steal her treasure. His method is to lie to her so often and over such tiny things as well as big ones that she comes to doubt her senses and her sanity. It's from the husband that we have the term gaslighter to name such behavior. What no one notes, though, is that he's not the only gaslighter in the film. The film opens with a different gaslighter, a public servant working for the city, who we see lighting the gaslights in the streets as darkness falls. This gaslighter is the opposite of the evil one. He doesn't disorient us and make us doubt our senses. He's part of the infrastructure that supports us as a community with common sense, living in one world. He lights the way. The street lights and the man who lights them are public things. They are what the shock politics of the last 4 years have tried to destroy, along with the post office, public lands, and public education. But public things, like a Truth and Reckoning Commission, are what give democracies their bearings. They provide us with the one world and the worldly orientation that democratic citizenship requires. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, Professor Tricia Rose at CSRA and the Watson Institute. It's a great honor to be with my colleagues here today. Well, I'll share the lack of optimism about whether we can definitely build common ground. I would like us to consider this possibility. Building a racial common ground, in my view, is going to necessitate affirmative efforts to address the sense of alienation that prevails among working class Americans. This sense of alienation requires us for us to think for a moment about a couple of things that are crucial. One of this is zero-sum racial competition and the detrimental rhetoric that has hindered group efforts to build respect and dignity for working class Black and Brown Americans. In my own research, I interviewed hundreds of working class Blacks, whites, and Latinos in the American South, particularly in contentious states like Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. What I found working in factories with some of these folks and talking to them in laundromats and warehouses and so forth, in my interviews with people and my work with them related to issues of race relation, is that I found that people have a general sense of alienation, and this general sense of alienation crosses across racial lines. Blacks, whites, and Latinos, but particularly Blacks and whites, feel very alienated in this moment in history. Now, for context, in the states that I mentioned, places like Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, race relations are still stated along the Black and white binary. Now, when I talk to white folks working day in and day out in factories and warehouses, white individuals felt like America had failed them. Specifically, they felt that they were losing ground to Blacks and Latinos. When I talked to Blacks in this same context, they also felt that America had failed them. Their issues, however, were that whites were impeding their advancement, while at the same time, they felt like Latinos were encroaching in their opportunities. So they told me. When I talked to Latinos, they also felt excluded and alienated. Well, and while Latinos held positive views of their possibilities in America, they felt discriminated against and they felt exploited. Now, in this picture, it's very difficult to feel any sense of optimism and any sense of having the conditions under which we can build common ground. And although Blacks, whites, and Latinos express different concerns when they talk about economic opportunities, all these different groups that I have been working with had one common response. They all felt that they were not respected. They fought against caricatures of themselves and ridicule. And they tried to get others to listen to their own stories. And so when we think, for example, the story of one of my respondents about this sense of alienation in the context of stereotypes, one of the key things that people would be taught for example, a white hairdresser told me that she never discusses her family or her personal life with her clients for fear of being labeled as a white trash or redneck. Now, many of my Black respondents talk about how they were fighting stereotypes of being lazy or having a chip of their shoulder. At the same time, many of my Latino respondents talk about being painted with a broad brush as criminals or alcoholics. So in thinking about all of this and in thinking about how we see some of these ideas filtering in the rhetoric that is been circulating in the media and the toxic ideas that have permeating in our society, it is not very easy to think about how we can build common ground. But one of the things that we can at least start thinking about is how we need to find or create enough opportunities for advancement so that people's first inclination is not to see economic advancement as a zero-sum game. Clearly, this is not trivial, but it is vital. And in places in the rural South and in places where there is the economic disadvantage, it's very easy for people to be pitted against one another and to have the conditions in which they can see each other as in terms of not someone who is going to be evoking negative ideas of members of their group. Second, we need to model and address respect and dignity across groups. And this is particularly the case in relation to Black and Brown folks. The one thing that is being very common and it's something that is hurtful in our communities is the fact that people can make every effort to fight stereotypes and caricatures and representations of who they are as groups and still not being able to convey and capture and recover their dignity. And so I think that any effort that we can make as we move forward needs to be very affirmative in ways in which we could take back, bring back the dignity to communities of color. These are just some ideas that I've been reflecting on, but again, at this point it's difficult to be optimistic, but we still have to keep moving forward in the direction of trying to do the best that we can to restore respect and dignity. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Trisha Rose. From the moment that it was safe to suggest that Joe Biden was the president-elect, the immediate dominant narrative frame for that transition was a call for unity and healing. I pledge, he said, to be a president who seeks not to divide but unify, who does not see red states and blue states, but only the United States. It's time, Biden said the next day, to put the anger and the harsh rhetoric behind us and come together as a nation. It's time for America to unite and heal. Vice President Kamala Harris seconded this notion and praised Biden as a healer, a uniter, a tested and steady hand. Now, on one level, this is not very surprising because Biden ran on a pledge to unite the country. That was a major narrative force for his platform. But this pledge and his statements looked quite different to me after the votes had been tallied and a president who had consistently and masterfully stoked division based on race and racism won the votes of over 73 million people. What do we do in that context? What do we do with that 73 million? Is this the time to heal and unify? What could it possibly mean to unite under these conditions? And how could this sudden call for unity generate healing? I want to make an argument today that this is not possible at this point. I do not think it can happen in this way. Unity is not the right answer right now, and healing is not yet possible. Now, this may seem stark to some of you, and it might appear to be a challenge that aims to perpetuate aggression, conflict, or violence. Yet that is the farthest thing from my hope. I think, though, that to call for unity so immediately, and without interrogation and examination of the basis of the divisions, and to call for healing given what's at stake, and to do so without a clear sense of how one might go about it, is actually a dangerous and yet familiar call. Why are these calls for unity and healing so dangerous, in my opinion? The first reason is the context of Trump's successful pandering to and expansion of the public renormalization of white supremacist discourses and actions. To paraphrase Adam Schatz, we must not underestimate the significance of the achievement of Trump's successful pandering to white grievance. Calls for unity that do not directly confront and reject this threat of white violent transformation of the public sphere contribute to the renormalization of this violence and place women, people of color, and immigrants in harm's way. I mean, there are many, many examples of this that many of my brilliant colleagues have articulated here, so I won't reiterate them. But the phrase, the Proud Boys stand down and stand by was not mentioned, and I just want to remind us of that very chilling moment during the debates. So to move immediately to a conversation in which healing and unity is paramount leaves little room for an effective challenge to the racist use of white grievance. The refusal to establish any clear terms for this unity while calling for it at the same time accepts unchallenged the consistent and strategically manipulated collapsing together of legitimate white economic grievances with the racist framing of those grievances that are designed to retain or expand the power of whiteness at the expense of non-whites. And so I want to emphasize this one more time, that there is a strategic collapsing together of a legitimate economic grievance with a racialized form of grievance that perpetuates white supremacy. It's not either or, it's actually how they have been collapsed together that renders them not very problematic and is to be distinguished from legitimate economic grievances. When politicians and pundits talk easily and quickly about healing this divided nation, I want to argue that they're actually reinforcing Trump's false equivalencies between the supposed radical left and the historic as well as contemporary white supremacist organizations and beliefs. These false equivalencies expand the legitimate space for white supremacy. This is the liberal version of good people on both sides. These are not simply different political points of view with a common set of values beneath them. But not only does it make more room for legitimized white supremacy, but it ends up marginalizing and stigmatizing protests for racial justice. It considers these protests part of the, quote, anger and hate that needs setting aside, end quote, and posits them as a part of the problem rather than a sign that there is a problem. Finally, these false equivalencies construct a reasonable white center, a sort of, a liberal, reasonable white core that benefits from and does not directly confront the enhanced powers fueled by white supremacy, and therefore constructs a kind of liberal white supremacy light. It sets up a false center position of tolerance of both sides that creates an alliance among whites at the expense of people of color. This alliance is solidified by white silence about racism, and premature calls for healing and unity rely fundamentally on this silence. For reasonable white liberals to speak out vociferously against systemic racism is to threaten this kind of unity and a kind that stigmatizes movements for justice. But to be quiet is to be complicit. Martin King spoke eloquently about this group of he called them group moderates. This group of whites, which he called white moderates, in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And I quote, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." So what would it take to truly heal a country divided in this way? Healing requires, I want to argue, a challenge to the white moderate or liberal to reject an order that relies on injustice. A fundamental reimagining of liberal whiteness is one critical facet of a racially just future. With whom will white liberals cast their lot? And the answer to this question, not necessarily only the Proud Boys and his friends, is critical to the future we will create. Resist the blind calls for unity and abusive terms for healing, and keep fighting for justice, because without this fight, there will be no unity and no healing, only negative peace and more racial suffering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you to all the panelists for your thought-provoking and moving comments. Again, I want to remind everybody in the audience who is participating via Zoom to ask your questions in the Q&A window, please. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube Live, you're welcome to post your comments, your questions there, and those will be relayed to me. Maybe I'll just start with one of the questions from the audience. An anonymous attendee notes that I'd be very interested to hear other panelists comment on Professor Honig's idea of a truth and reckoning process. Is it worth pushing for? What do you imagine happening if such an effort were tried? And, I'll just add maybe my own addition to that question. And this ties all the way back to Melvin Rogers' expression of this sense of betrayal by so many people who voted for President Trump. If so much of the electorate, so much of the population is living geographically separated from other portions of the population. So if there's racial division geographically, if there's division through different media channels, people listening to different versions of the truth and kind of in their own discourse, how can we really bring these two worlds into intersection to get to that truth and reckoning kind of discussion? And I'll just open it up to the panel. And again, encourage everybody in the audience to keep asking your questions.
Well, I'll just pipe in very quickly. There's no question that this notion that truth is a personal opinion is a real problem in terms of what a truth and reckoning committee or commission might look like. But that is actually all the more reason that it's crucial to try. And I'm not sure it would actually come from Biden and Kamala, but I suspect they wouldn't be hostile to it. And that might be just the cover needed to produce a fundamental challenge to the loss of the notion that there are facts and then there are perspectives on facts. So to me, it's actually a wonderful idea, even as it might and probably will fail, right? It establishes, I would argue, the possibility of a truth, a notion that there are facts and that there are truths, and that, you know, in order for us to reconcile this conflict, we have to be able to talk about them.
Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in?
I would. I normally agree with my colleague Bonnie on all things, but I would say I have a lot of trepidation about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Certainly, it should not be public. It should not be a public commission. I think that what would happen were there such a commission, that Donald Trump would use it as a fundraising opportunity. We know he has a lot of debts he has to pay off. That's kind of what he's doing now. So, and I think it would keep him alive in ways that are detrimental to moving forward. So I do think that something like that perhaps doesn't have that name, that could go on in civil society organizations. I'm thinking of religious congregations, and you know, it's hard now because so much of America is not involved in religious congregations, but I think it has to take place in those kinds of contexts where people want to be honest. I don't, you know, or where people come to it with some kind of honest sense. I don't see how, I think it can actually contribute to more parallel worlds if it's not done right, rather than bringing those parallel worlds together.
Can I speak? Sorry?
Sure. I think Ainsley, you wanted to. Okay, Bonnie, go ahead, and then Ainsley, I hope you'll jump in.
Yeah, I hope so too. I want to hear what Ainsley has to say. I would just say that it's a big idea, and in the sense of, I really do imagine all kinds of civil society groups taking part in it, it being differentiated, plural, and happening in all kinds of places all across the country, just like WPA projects. That's why I was like, you know, think of it as a Truth New Deal. And then some parts of those processes would be photographed and filmed, just like the WPA projects under the first New Deal. About the risk of keeping him alive, I just would rather ignore him. I understand that that's a risk, but I can't think of many things that we can do if we worry about what he might do. And so I think that's something to take on board in terms of how to think about the design of a project like this. But I also don't, I just don't want to be playing chess or checkers or Monopoly with that guy anymore. And the last thing I'll say is, I called it Truth and Reckoning, not Reconciliation, to chasten the ambition of the project. It really is about trying to establish some facts. And I am as in despair about the 70 million people who voted for him after the list of things enumerated by both Trisha and Melvin in our forum. But we can't give up on them. I mean, we just can't, because we have to go on with them somehow. And so this is part of what has to be a much larger project of civic education. It can't be the only thing.
I just wanted to say quickly that it's not clear to me that we have any control over whether Trump will die or not, because we are seeing Republican elites stand by him even though he has lost, right? So that's like one thing. And he has this base, this constituency that shows up for him. Like, it was just a picture of like a MAGA rally, you know, talking about, you know, how the vote was stolen, right? So I don't know if not being public is going to somehow take the wind out of his sail. I think some of this stuff is already beyond our control. And it seems to me that we're going to have to take sides. I mean, more of us going to have to take sides and get ready to fight, because it seems as if that's the road that we are being taken to, whether we want to or not.
Go ahead, Melvin.
Yeah, just a sort of quick word on this. So the first thing I would say about what Bonnie has put on the table for us is that it is a big idea. And it is meant to match the gravity of the problem that we find ourselves confronting. And in some sense, nothing short of a big idea actualized will go to the heart of this issue. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility of what a Truth and Reckoning Commission would reveal, which is why I like this term of reckoning rather than reconciliation, that it actually may reveal to us those of our fellows who are actually not interested in coming along. I mean, we have this idea about living in a democratic society, and that the aim of it always seems to sort of terminate in unity and harmony. But sometimes democracy as an ideal and a practice reveals its end. That is to say, it reveals the inability of the practices that it wants to institute, deliberation, representation, to actually bring about that harmony. It points to the inability to do just that. And I think a Truth and Reckoning Commission, were it taken up, I think it's a wonderful idea, but we need to be prepared for what it might reveal to us. And this is where I'm doubtful. I'm doubtful that we're ready for what it will reveal.
Melvin, just a quick point on that. Doesn't the political deadlock in the United States over the last years, or the deadlock in the Obama administration and deadlock in Congress, doesn't that already reveal the dead end in some sense that democracy is reached?
No, I think that's right. But I take Bonnie's suggestion. I want to take that suggestion on as my own too. I take it to be an attempt to sort of hammer this out in a public forum, which is to say, to try to aim for a kind of nonpartisan arena, right? And presumably the nonpartisan arena is meant to sort of circumnavigate precisely what you laid out. But Ed, once again, one conclusion of this may reveal that all of what you just laid out is really where we are, and is where we are in an inescapable way. Right?
Great, thanks. There's so many questions I have now, but I am going to resist and instead turn to the audience. So we have a comment and a question from our colleague here at Brown, Nadia Alali. And Nadia writes, I agree that it is a nearly impossible challenge right now, finding common ground within the US, given the huge polarization and acute sense of betrayal due to the racism, white supremacy, sexism, and xenophobia we're witnessing. Ironically, the most likely common ground we might see is the construction of a non-American enemy, an enemy other, for example, refugees or Islam. My question is about finding common ground across the globe. What kind of dialogues, healing, and strategies are needed to assure people across the world that the US is going to change its course of destructive interventions, ignorant and incompetent meddling, and the total disavowal of collective commitments where poverty, displacement, the environment, and climate are concerned? It's a profound question. Any takers on the panel?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in because no one else is. This isn't my territory generally, but I think back to Martin. This emphasis on challenging militarism around the world and the sort of expansion and of American empire in the context of destroying other people's culture and sovereignty. And capitalism in that global context as well are going to have to be reconfigured in the Biden presidency if they're going to be reassuring in any way. Do I think that's likely to happen? Probably not. I think we have a better chance of seeing some moderate changes domestically, and I say moderate in the most moderate way, than we do in the international context, which I think is a really serious crisis that should also be part of, this notion of truth and reckoning, or sort of reimagining, creating context for knowledge, are not going to be just about race in America, but the use of race and anti various religious groups and so on, and women around the world in ways that completely mirror the problems we're facing here. So I think I absolutely a great idea to do it, but I don't think I'm actually less optimistic about that than about the other subjects we were addressing earlier.
I too am skeptical that the U.S. can quickly, or even not so quickly, signal some kind of change in direction. I mean, on the one hand, there was a very positive signal when we had such huge voter turnout and many people voting, including Black and Brown Americans, against, voting in spite of obstacles all over the place. And that is a statement about, if not American democracy, at least American citizens. But, on the other hand, this is, I think, echoing the tenor of Nadia's question or comment. One of the things that seems to unite the political spectrum is this kind of growing xenophobia, including with respect to China. I mean, there are issues with China's rise, but there's also a lot of racialization of policy toward China in the United States now, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. Let me read another question from the audience. This comes from an anonymous attendee. What do you, all on the panel, what do you think of the Braver Angels project to gather across political divides to talk deeply about the perspectives that appear to divide us? Any comments generally about these efforts to get people to speak across divides? Any that you've seen in your, yeah, Ainsley.
I mean, I don't really know about this effort in particular, but it sounds like a good idea to me. I mean, I think talking and trying to build, consensus and sort of create spaces where people can publicly reason with each other. And I don't mean reason in a sort of kind of like normative way, the way you have to sort of present yourself to talk and to converse. But I think that that's important. But I also think that, though the kinds of openings those discussions can provide, yet again, to use the word that's like kind of stuck with me, can be squandered, because when people then leave those spaces and then return back to regular life, the kinds of political structures, social structures, pressures, the ways in which policy decisions work, the way our everyday lives are situated and organized, sort of draw us back into the inertia of our, regular habits and ways of interacting. So, and thinking about these things, and also the minimal power that each individual has to really change and shape the wider collectives that they're a part of. And so I think those efforts are important, but we really need to think about what it looks like to, I don't know, connect those kinds of very local specialized efforts to grander governing structures. Like, what does it look like to connect those things in a more meaningful way? And I think that that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, Laura, please. You need to unmute yourself.
I was thinking that, yes, I mean, I'm not familiar with the this particular effort, but I'm also somebody who, believes that, yeah, it's good that people who are in opposite sides come and talk to each other, particularly within the context of division. But when you have such a xenophobic environment, it's really difficult to know how to create these spaces. And I also want to think about, the possibilities of potentially doing this more institutionally. And I'm coming back to what Margaret was talking about earlier in terms of, if there are, in my view, efforts to, or or if there are possibilities for unification and for people to come in productive conversations, they're going to be in places where the norms for productive conversations already exist. For example, churches or places of worship, or places where there is some sort of grounds for people to listen to one another. And there's plenty of research that actually has illustrated that those are possible scenarios. The other thing that I was thinking about is to not overlook at regional differences, and that the norms of where these conversations happen might vary depending on where we are situated geographically. A lot of our possibilities are happening in the coasts, but there are, we need to start thinking about how to create these spaces in places like the Midwest or the South. And I think that this is, again, back to what kinds of institutional conditions exist that enable for productive discussions.
Bonnie, did you want to jump in?
Just very briefly, I just wanted to point out, Ainsley said this, and I think Laura says this as well, that when we talk about consensus, we talk about building consensus. And that means that it's a process, and it takes time. You don't normally find consensus. We don't usually talk about consensus that way. And I thought that Margaret's suggestions were really good, that she was really right to point out the importance of both the top down of policing the police and the bottom up of organizing and building consensus and mobilization. I do think Ainsley was really right to say, often we build consensus and then we leave, and we don't really address how to sustain it in the absence of a kind of intervention, which is a possible failure of examples like the one you named. I too do not know that one. But I know others where you get people together for a summer or for a few weeks and then you leave and you hope, but people go back to where they were eventually. So one thought I had while I was listening to both of you talking is how we could maybe explore the thing that we deplore, which is the micromedia thing, how we're all in our separate little media silos. And that maybe we could explore, I don't want to say there's an app for that, that's not what I'm saying, but maybe there's some kinds of media formations that we could develop that would help sustain build consensus after a while, and that there might be, not just the evils of media, but also some supportive mechanisms that could be developed for that. So to pull people out of their micro silos and into something else.
And can I just say,
Yes, please.
When I think of the top-down powers of government, I don't think it just in form of police, but aggressive use of what laws there are to ensure people's rights. And from below, I'm not talking about consensus. I'm thinking more about building power, building majorities that have power. And we're not going to have consensus in this country. And I think, the goal is to build power for people who want to build a strong, multiracial democracy where the public role helps to provide people with that respect. It provides policies that help people feel respected, that makes them feel like they have some opportunity. Some of the things that Laura was saying that are just people feel are missing in the United States now. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I had exactly the same reaction. Thanks for clarifying, Margaret, because while I'm supportive of the idea of trying to build consensus and empathy, so many of the panelists' comments, I think, were fundamentally about power and the use of power to remove portions of the population really from having a voice and having a say. And if that's the case, it seems that the solution involves some kind of turnover of power. And I think that's, if I could say, why some on the panel were resistant to the idea of a Biden presidency working with a Republican Senate and cutting deals, and because that's not really about replacing power. Maybe we'll move on to a question from Kim. Yes.
Ed, before we move on,
yes, please.
On this point about power, the one thing about living in a democratic society, I think we all know, is that power never really remains in one hands, right? It moves around. And so if this is simply about building power without fundamentally transforming the individuals who wield it, then you're just really just buying time, right? Until power swings back, and only for you to find yourself under its boot and under its thumb.
Perfect. Now you've provoked many other questions for me, but I'm going to hold off again. Thank you, Melvin. Let's go to Kim, who asks, I'm curious about the importance of investing in maintaining the social movement organizations formed in the last 4 years versus regrouping with new organizations in this time, or at this time. In particular, I'm curious about the potential and limits of the Women's March. Anybody like to comment on that?
I will. I think I don't know that much specifically about the organization, the Women's March, although I seem to receive a lot of emails from them. But what I would say is that I do think that the Women's March gave rise to a lot of more locally rooted efforts. Laura Putnam has written about this in Pittsburgh. I know of efforts in the California that grew out of that march. So I think it's more about what connections were made through the Women's March, and then what people have created in these locally rooted contexts to try to rebuild a presence of constructive politics that has been missing. So that's my sense of it.
Any other comments on building from some of the organizational energy of the past 4 years? Okay, let's move on.
I'll
Yes.
say some more.
Yes, please do, Margaret.
The thing I want to say is that the tremendous organizational energy should be, and I think it is, starting right now to prepare for the next period of time. Democrats have this habit of doing campaigns and then saying, oh, well, let's go to brunch. And it is critical, Republicans and the right have this very well articulated infrastructure of organizations. And this is the moment to take those and make them permanent features of an infrastructure in the way that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, rather than to go to brunch.
Great. We'll go on to another question. This is from Bob Schwartz, Brown class of 70, who writes from Atlanta, Georgia. What I hear in this room full of academics seems so divorced from what I think of as the quote unquote real world in which most of the country's lay people. Everything I hear is in the same language that the Fox News trolls love to make fun of, like to ridicule in front of their non-academic audience. My question then is this: how do we go about getting the non-academia population of working class, non-Ivy League elite America to, quote, buy in to these changes? These people do not, for the most part, think of themselves as racist, and we totally lose them if we insist on having this conversation in, quote unquote, our academia-oriented vocabulary. We end up talking in different languages with no common agreement as to the vocabulary. So of course we talk past each other. Anybody like to respond to that? Are we using, yeah, go ahead, Bonnie.
So I don't fully accept that, with all due respect. And I would just say a lot of us have a lot of voices. I did some phone banking during the period running up to the election. I didn't talk about Pandora in that setting. That didn't seem appropriate. But I was fully capable of speaking for half an hour sometimes to people who were thinking about voting and wanted to talk about that. So I'm not. I want to just push back gently on that idea. I think that we're thinking about how to go on in a seminar from Brown to share with people our thoughts, but we have other ways of other languages as well at our command. I do think the work that has been done in Georgia and Arizona is so impressive, and is a model in both places for us to learn from. And most importantly, I'm struck by the paradox. This may be something that people in American politics are just very familiar with. And if so, you know, I won't go on about it, but it is so interesting that the Democrats stand for a kind of state building project to address people's needs, collective needs. But they don't party build, whereas the Republicans are just very focused on party building and party discipline on behalf of minimizing the state. And I'm just very struck by that. If we took the skills that we have on the Democratic side for state building and applied them to party building and ideas and building, I agree, not consensus, but some overlap, then we could do a lot better for the country, I think. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that. I think we need to get out there more. Maybe that's where I agree with the questioner.
Yeah. I have a quick thought. Laura, did you want to go ahead, Laura?
I'll go after you, Tricia.
Okay. I want to focus in on one piece of the comment, which I think is really interesting, which is that people don't buy into these changes and that they don't, for the most part, think of themselves as racist. So we lose them if we insist on having the conversation this way. So I guess what I would ask is, why are we losing them when they don't see themselves as racist? And how can we explain how racism works in such a way that they might better understand it if they simply don't see themselves that way? And so I'm not sure how much of this is about language, although that's certainly an issue. There's no question academic jargon can be a problem. I would be remiss if I were to argue with that point, but I'm not sure that's what's happening in this conversation exactly. And I would say that one of the hallmarks of racism is it's in the fact that it always finds itself at ever extreme examples of itself. So that racism is only when you carry a tiki torch and call people bad names. And then 6 weeks later, it's even worse than that. And then it's saying this word, and then but all of this operative racism, which I'm arguing liberals need to pay attention to. White liberals need to understand that they are complicit in this situation and really do some real homework. They don't want to hear that either, but it's not because of academic jargon. It's because recognizing the work of racism is actually really hard to do. So I guess that would just be my point of intervention. But I agree with Bonnie a lot that, you know, there are different settings where we use different language to talk to different people, and there are millions of activists doing incredible on the ground work for this. And I think everyone has a role to play, and you know, I don't think it's all or nothing. I hope that helps Brian give you a slightly different take on what you're thinking there. Thank you.
Other comments?
Yeah.
Laura, yeah.
Yeah, I just
And then
wanted
Ainsley.
to, I mean, I completely agree with what Tricia and Bonnie have said, but I wanted to add, as you know, as someone who studies the everyday life of people, and I'm just thinking that, you know, when we have also situations in which people live segregated and in which people also are not in contact with one another in their realities of their lives, it becomes really difficult to build this common ground. And one of the things that I found in my research is that, you know, when you have very sharp divisions, let's say in a factory that is systematically discriminating people, when they see each other working together, sharing very difficult circumstances with one another, often you don't have to have, you know, a political ideology about it. The people are just very in tune with the realities and the difficulties that they are experiencing. And so, but I think that the challenge of having the opportunity to understand people's humanities, and it comes when we have structural situations or situations in which people are disadvantaged, when people are pitted against one another, when people are put in situations of competition, and also when people are fighting for scarce resources. And so I think that it's not just about rhetoric, but it's also about is a reality that people are facing. And so I think that it goes beyond conversations. It's also about how people have to fight segregation and how people have to fight structural disadvantage.
Ainsley, did you want to add?
I just want to say quickly that there are good faith, sort of ways that people might not see themselves as part of the problem. And then there's rhetorical moves to basically, delegitimize the kind of problem space one is trying to open up by talking about racism. I mean, we saw Trump do, like, he literally, to harken back to what Trisha Rose sort of reminded us of, he literally said to the Proud Boys to stand by, right? Like, stand back and stand by. But yet in another debate said he's the least racist person he's ever met. So it just shows to you the vacuousness of some of that language and some of that talk. And we're going to have discernment when we talk to people and be able to pick out those folks that are playing games and those people who are really coming to the space in good faith and wanting to engage. And I think that, yeah, that's just as important. And that's not I don't think that's an academic, non-academic thing. That's, folks who are committed to white domination and those who are not. And I also want to say that there's this great book called American While Black that I think talks about, that contextualizes Black folks' concern about immigrants. And it reveals a pattern that one would say structures Black voting patterns, Black political ideology across the board. And that is an acknowledgement of and concern with white supremacy. And so, the way in which we're even talking about this multiracial support that the Republicans got because the Black vote went up, I mean, you cannot, like, that's, and then want to tell another story about how white men's, support for Trump declined. These are decontextualized ways of even accounting for what's going on. And you can't, like, the Black vote, I mean, you have 18% of Black men supporting Trump. That's 82% of them. Did I do the math right? 82% of them that you don't see those kinds of numbers, those kinds of like racial numbers for one party in any other racial group. So we can't, like, to even have that kind of discussion, to me is ridiculous. It's decontextualized, and it's sort of like populating the public sphere with, a decontextualized understanding of the racial circumstances that we are facing right now. Which I think, the greatest peril is white domination. And we're going to have to break it up. We have to find ways to break it up. And we should not allow sort of like, these other racial stories, whatever, to sort of distort, I think, that cold and hard fact.
Melvin, yes.
Very quickly, and this is really sort of agreeing with what has already been said. But look, we live in an extraordinarily diverse society, but is also a highly segregated one. I mean, just right. And the thought is that if we were less segregated, that the intimacy of that would help break down some of the barriers that we continue to face. Just being in close proximity, right? Struggling together, achieving together. One of the mistakes about this move, which I partly agree with, but one of the mistakes about this move is that it sort of fails to grapple with the fact that we're dealing with a population of voters that perceive their dominance and power to be in decline. And we have to come to grips with the truth of that. And many folks on this will know that I'm normally the sort of hope guy, the guy with, right, the sort of peddling faith, as it were. But we need to come to grips with the fact that there's a sizable portion of the American electorate that just does not want to come along, right? And the more we sort of buy into the claim that the onus falls on the folks that are struggling for justice, that they need to persuade those who are not to come along, the more we fall for that, the more we'll be unwilling to recognize that there's just a portion of our brothers and sisters that just don't want to be connected anymore. And that's a sort of difficult realization, but it is something that I do think we have to grapple with.
Let's go. We just have a few minutes left, but we have time for at least one more question. This is a question from Michael Gross, who notes that he says, I'm interested in the different forms of discrimination practiced in this country: segregation of Blacks, coercive assimilation of Native Indians, Native Americans, and a combination of both with respect to Hispanics and Spanish speakers on the East Coast and Southwest. And I think what Michael Gross is asking is, how do those different forms of discrimination interact, and how does the fact of these different forms make, say, more difficult to solve our racial and ethnic dilemmas in this country? Any comments?
Maybe I'll just say a quick thing related to the question, which is that, cities are both less segregated than they used to be in some areas of the country. Also, some cities are segregated in the ways that are described. These are not, as the word segregation implies, obviously not accidental and deliberately pursued very often. But a related thing is gerrymandering, which puts too many people into safe seats where they no longer have to figure out how to appeal to more than one demographic. And I think as an institutional matter, and that's where I'm a little more comfortable responding to this question, as an institutional matter, that's something that can be addressed institutionally in terms of how districts are redrawn. We have to overcome, obviously, the self-interests and the party interests that have become dominant in this way. But segregation occurs partly through, not just through the neighborhoods that different people live in, but through a decision that their political representation will be a matter of putting some minority neighborhoods in very small numbers in otherwise dominantly white districts, so that they're basically unrepresented. And I think that's also a problem to be thought of together with this.
I think, Bonnie, your answer might be related to a different question that was asked by Gordon Bates. He asked, does Emily Wilkerson's book Caste provide a useful analysis for this discussion? And I take that to mean, does the notion of a whole interlocking set of social and political and economic institutions to enforce a kind of social hierarchy, is that really what we're seeing in play in the United States?
I have not read that book, so I'm going to let someone else. I'm going to let someone else answer if they want to. Any
other comments about that?
Well, it's right behind me over there. It just came in the Amazon bundle, so I haven't read it either. But it is Isabel Wilkerson. Just in case.
I'm sorry.
People. Yeah. No, it was written as Emily in the Q&A. I just wanted to make sure in case someone went to look for it. But I want to try to answer the other question before we go, out of respect, but also because it's an important question, which is to think about, the construction of racial hierarchy as part of a broader colonial project that is multifaceted and related partly to the nature of the opportunities for the ways labor could be controlled, land could be seized, and profits secured, And that depended a lot on the circumstances of the point of meeting and the contexts of the exercise of power. But there is very frequently, perhaps not all the time, but very frequently, a shifting, a development of an ever shifting boundaries around who gets to be white. And while there's lots of distinctions about who's what and how smart one group is through some crazy pseudoscience and this, that, and the other, whiteness, although, and some people get grandfathered into whiteness, like say the Irish, for example, who didn't start out white, being white is always at the top of the hierarchy. So whether it's Native, Indigenous people, or other colonial contexts in the Caribbean, et cetera, and so on, there is a racial hierarchy that transcends all of those different relationships to capitalism and power and hierarchy. So I guess that's what I'd be careful to do, is to draw those really critical distinctions, but be mindful of the fact that whiteness is constructed at the top and managed, persevered, negotiated, and so on and so forth. There's a really great book by Ian Haney Lopez called White by Law that might be an interesting place to start for anyone who's interested.
We've come to the end of the session, but again, I want to thank all the panelists: Melvin Rogers, Margaret Weir, Ainsley Lasur, Bonnie Honig, Laura López-Sanders, and Tricia Rose. Thank you all for your really profound comments. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for not just listening, but for participating and providing your comments and questions and opinions. We face many, many challenges ahead in the United States and abroad as well. But I really feel that this panel, just by the depth of the conversation, suggests that while there may or may not be cause for optimism, there are ways out of this, and there are ways to rethink this. And I trust there are ways to move forward despite the hurdles. Again, thank you all.